Good afternoon. I'm Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and this is a significant day at the Atlantic Council. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the launch of two reports on the war in Ukraine, our own hiding in plain sight, Putin's war in Ukraine, and then the exclusive English language release of Boris Nemtsov's Putin's War. And so we look forward to rolling out both of these reports for you today, which I think when you take them together will ensure that Putin's secret war in Ukraine, or at least secret among some, is no longer secret. I want to offer a special welcome to our audience watching online, especially those in Ukraine and Russia who've tuned into our live website or webcast at night. I encourage everyone to join our conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #PutinAtWar. We will be hearing remarks both in English and in Russian today. For those in the audience here at the Atlantic Council, turn your headsets to Channel 2 for English and to Channel 1 for Russian. At the Atlantic Council, we are acutely aware that the ongoing war in Ukraine's east is not just about Ukraine. It's about the global order, it's about the future of Europe whole and free, and it's about the future of Russia itself. The men and women on the front lines of Ukraine are not just defending themselves, they are defending the rules of international engagement that have delivered security and stability in Europe since the end of the Cold War. That's why in February 2014, the Council launched its Ukraine in Europe initiative. This initiative galvanizes international support for an independent Ukraine that chooses its own destiny within secure borders, whose people within secure borders. The Council's work aims to strengthen Ukraine's security, preserve its territorial integrity, and advance democratic, economic, and governance reforms. I'd first like to recognize those who have supported this initiative from the start. George Chapivsky and the Chapivsky Family Foundation, Ambassador Julie Finley, Frontera Resources, Ian Inatovich and Marta Witter, Lena Kosharny and Horizon Capital, James Temerity, the Smith Richardson Foundation, George Lund, who helped us gain support from throughout the Atlantic Council Board, and the Ukraine World Congress led by President Eugene Cholai and Vice President Paul Grod. And Paul, it's great to have you here today from Canada. Against the backdrop of this mission, our conversation today focuses on a central question in the Ukraine crisis, and that is the Kremlin's role in the conflict. These reports, taken together, argue that the war's toll, more than 6,000 dead, tens of thousands wounded, and nearly 1.3 million displaced persons are the direct result of Vladimir Putin's decisions and actions. Since the beginning of the crisis, the Kremlin has been waging a highly sophisticated hybrid war involving subversion, Russian leadership of armed groups, Russian weapons, Russian money, Russian propaganda, and regular Russian troops. All the while, Vladimir Putin insists that Russia is not involved in the conflict in Ukraine. Some take this claim at face value. Many hear contradictory information and don't know what is true. The purpose of these reports is to shed light on this deception. The reports were produced independently of each other, but reach the same conclusions, and that is Putin's Russia is at war with Ukraine. The Atlantic Council report, Hiding in Plain Sight, Putin's War in Ukraine, provides evidence exposing Russia's military involvement in Ukraine's east, drawing on publicly available information. It chronicles the full spectrum of the Kremlin's war in Ukraine. In Ukraine's east, drawing on publicly available information, it chronicles the full spectrum of the Kremlin's war in Ukraine using open source investigative techniques. It reveals how Russia's military equipment moves into Ukraine, where training camps have been built on the border, and pinpoints the Russian origins of cross-border artillery attacks on Ukraine territory. As Michael Gordon wrote about the report in this morning's New York Times, quote, and this is from Michael Gordon's piece, in an attempt to puncture the Russian denials, independent experts have operated like digital Sherlock Holmeses, using Google Street View, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, satellite photographs, and Russia's version of Facebook, including social media updates by Russian soldiers. That research was then supplemented by more traditional sources like court documents and local media reports. The analysis in the report uses innovative social media forensics and geolocation methodology, pioneered by one of the co-authors of the report, Elliot Higgins. Elliot couldn't join us in person today, but we'll see him on video. The report was the direct result of a collaborative effort between the Atlantic Council's Executive Vice President, Damon Wilson, Dinu Patriciu Eurasia Center Director, Ambassador John Herbst, Associate Director Alina Polyakova, and my own Special Assistant, Max Chupersky. Very proud of your work on this, Max, as well as over a dozen volunteer researchers and interns who spent hours fact-checking the report. And we'll hear from the co-authors momentarily. It's a great privilege to also be joined by the team that gathered Boris Nemtsov's evidence of Putin's war in Ukraine after the opposition leader was slain in view of the Kremlin on February 27th, 2015. And anybody who spent time in Moscow knows exactly the spot on the bridge where that took place. At great risk to their own freedom and livelihood, the team tracked down what was left of Mr. Nemtsov's report and published it in Moscow 2 weeks ago. Today, we honor Mr. Nemtsov's legacy with the release of the official English version of Putin's war. On June 12th, we will honor Boris Nemtsov again, and the memory of Boris Nemtsov, with an Atlantic Council Freedom Award at the Wrocław Global Forum in Poland, and that award will be presented by Gary Kasparov. Two of the report's authors and opposition leaders, Ilya Yashin and Leonid Martynuk, traveled from Russia to be with us here today, and we're delighted to have them here. Thank you so much for making the trip, and we look forward to hearing from you. Before I invite them to the stage to present the report, though, I do want to read just the first couple of lines from the foreword that Damon and I wrote for the report, because this is so important, because what can sometimes be misunderstood when we take on these issues is that somehow this is anti-Russian, or somehow we're doing this against Russia. Let me read the 2 lines. For 25 years, prominent members of the Atlantic Council community have worked to advance the vision of a Europe whole, free, and at peace, in which Russia enjoys its peaceful place. In fact, many in our community aspired not only for a strategic partnership with Russia, but envisioned an alliance between Russia and NATO, contributing to international stability and security. And that remains the vision of many of us at the Atlantic Council as a medium-term and long-term goal. Unfortunately, Russian President Vladimir Putin's actions in Ukraine today mock this vision and threaten the international order established at the end of the Cold War. So we do this work not against Russia, but actually for the international community, for a Europe whole and peace, for Ukraine, and ultimately also for Russia. With that, let me pass the floor to Mr. Yashin and Mr. Martynuk.
Да нет, все в порядке. Здравствуйте, уважаемые.
Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to see you, and thank you for coming up. With your permission, I would like to give you bad news that we received from Moscow before we start talking about the report. I would like to tell you that in Moscow, our ally Vladimir Karamurza is in a very bad health. His body is Actually, he's now in induced coma, and there is a suspicion that Vladimir was poisoned, and actually his organs are failing. Vladimir is one of the most active. He lived in the United States for a long time. About a year ago or half a year ago, he came back to Russia and he started to be very active in opposition. He became the member of the bureau of our party. He is in charge of some election projects on behalf of Mr. Khodorkovsky. Most likely he was poisoned. And the detail is that Vladimir Kara-Murza turned to be in the hospital on the day 3 months after the death of Boris Nemtsov to the date. And the symbolism of this date is unbelievable. I would like to tell you about this story in order to attract your attention to the destiny of Vladimir. We wish him health. We hope that he will get better, even though he is in a very bad, very poor health. I hope that Leonid will agree with me that I want this episode to be known everywhere, not only in Russia, but in the whole world. 3 months ago, our friend died, Boris Nemtsov. Nemtsov was one of the brightest oppositionists in Russia. He was one of the most charismatic Russian politicians, and Nemtsov was a great Russian patriot. At the same time, Nemtsov loved Ukraine unconditionally. He loved the language, the people, the culture of Ukraine. Nemtsov was concerned about the war that Putin initiated between our countries. Nemtsov was a person of peace, and he tried to repair the relations between our countries. Nemtsov wanted to tell the Russian society about this crime, and even though it was war. And that was the idea behind putting the Putin war report. Before his death, Nemtsov started to work on this report. He got his own sources. He put together the plan of this report and started to work on it actively. He didn't have a chance to finish this work. On February 27th, 2015, he was killed next to Kremlin's wall, about 100 meters from the residency of Putin. He was shot into his back, and until now, nobody identified the criminals or those who ordered the killing. We understand that while Putin is in the Kremlin, those who ordered the killing will be free. We would like to make sure that the fight that Nemtsov was fighting and gave up his life to be continued. And that's why all of our efforts were focused on continuing his work and finish his report, Putin War. In this report, we have strong evidence of the presence of the Russian troops in Ukraine. The report shows good evidence that during this year, Putin was lying to Russians that there are no Russian troops in Donbass. The easiest part for us was the Crimea part. And I would like to remind you that in March 2014, when the operation started in the Crimea, the annexation of Crimea, the Russian society heard from Putin that there is some self-defense forces there, and the Russian troops have nothing to do with it. But they said, well, those people have Russian uniforms with no insignia on it. And Putin would say, well, they probably bought it somewhere in the store. A year later, Putin's rhetoric changed cardinally. Putin admitted openly that that was Russian special forces, and that was a military operation that was under the command of Putin personally. And this information was broadcasted on the Russian TV. Putin admitted it openly on the TV. The head of the one of the largest countries of the world with their nuclear potentials was publicly lying to his people and the whole world. And we want to focus the Russian society on this and show it to them. And if Putin was lying here, then he will lie in the future. We want to tell the Russians that Russia actually, and the Putin actually disregarded the international commitments of Russia. Russia made commitments to be a guarantor of territorial integrity of Ukraine. Ukraine, by the way, paid for it a very high price. Not everybody remembers it. Within the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapon. The logic of this decision of our neighbors was understood and clear. Why do they need any nuclear power, nuclear weapon, if there is a neighbor on the east who is ready to come to help you at any time? Putin actually destroyed the reputation of our country by backstabbing Ukraine. And this is a cynical war. There is no closer people in the world to Russians than Ukrainians. And the fact that Putin hit them in the back is a shame for our country. Putin says that there are no Russian troops in Ukraine. We collected many testimonies and evidence of the Russian troops who participated personally in military actions there. I would like to give you several examples. This young man is a Russian parachutist, Nikolai Kozlov, airborne troop. In March 2014, he personally participated in blocking the sites in Crimea within the Crimean operation. And while he was the Russian military, he participated in the Crimean campaign wearing a Ukrainian policeman uniform. Here is the picture of him. After annexation of the Crimea, Kozlov came back home to Ulyanovsk city, where he received the medal for returning the Crimea. That's the picture with his medal on his chest. He had the time to get married after that and vacation. And in August 2014, he came back to Ukraine again. He was drafted within one of the units. He participated in suppression of the artillery fighting in Ukraine. He was shot at. He was shelled. He was within the troop that was shelled, and then he was wounded. His leg was amputated, and now he's a disabled veteran. This information we received thanks to the civic position of his uncle Sergei, who told us about the destiny of his nephew and gave us these pictures. The other example, the Russian tank armored man from Buryatia, Domonkuyev. He also participated in military operations near the village of Debaltsevo. He was seriously wounded, and here is his pictures in the Donetsk hospital. This is an active Russian military. He admitted his participation in fighting. One of the most important parts of the report is the equipment, the Russian equipment, and its use in fighting. The position of the separatists, is as follows. The equipment that is used against the Ukrainian army is the trophy equipment that they were able to get during their fights, their battles. That's the lie. That's lie. But it is very hard to counter this lie because very often both Russian and Ukrainian troops would use the same type of military equipment. But there are some exceptions that helped us to identify the lies of the Kremlin and the separatists. We analyzed the text of Minsk agreement that was signed by both Putin and Poroshenko during their negotiations. And in Minsk negotiations, they state this Tornado S system. Military system. This is military equipment that was exclusively made only in Russia and has never been exported. There is only one country in the world that would have Tornado S system. It's Russia only. By signing the agreement, the Minsk agreement, where it states that Tornado S system has to be withdrawn from the territory of military actions, Putin actually, in documents, admitted that he transferred these systems to separatists. There is another example. We're talking about the system Panzer S1. This is a missile system of the Russian product that was exported, but there was only one country that has that equipment, and it's neighboring Ukraine, and it's only Russia. During a long period of time, the separatists denied that they have Tornado S system and Panzer S1 systems. But we were able to print in our report screenshot from video registrator where this system is shown next to the billboard with the pictures of separatists, of leaders of Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republic. What other proofs do you need? We put together this report because we are patriots of Russia. Our goal is to defend national interests of Russia. We believe that Putin's war in Ukraine is destructive for our country, both politically and economically and morally. This war is a shame of Russia. For Russia. That's why we, as Russian patriots, try to make sure that the war stops, and we are working on stopping it, and our goal is to deliver this information to the Russian society. But for us, it is also very important to make sure that the world also focuses on this war. Thank you. Leonid Martinyuk. In the end of 2014, Boris Nemtsov paid attention to two interesting facts. According to the polling of public, most of Russians believe that Russia should not participate in the conflict of Donbass militarily. On the other hand, the majority of Russians believe that there are no Russian military troops in Donbass. At that time, he already thought that there is a need to provide this information to the majority of Russians, because if Russians, he believed, would learn that there were troops in Ukraine, Russian troops in Ukraine, and they're against it, then that would affect Putin's rating. Because it was very important for Putin, the weakest point is that he is following his rating very closely. The rating that we hear from officials, polling sociologists, probably is very far from realistic one, but he receives the real numbers, the realistic numbers. I put together the chapter, or restored the chapter about the Boeing shutting down and about Donbass. I'm talking that I restored that part because I tried to write that chapter based on the posts on Facebook made by Boris Nemtsov. Boris Nemtsov, on the first and second day after on July 17, 2014, the Boeing was shut down, he paid attention and he attracted the attention to the official information in Russian mass media. They noted that on the 17th of July, about Therese, about around 4 o'clock and 24, airplane was shut down. After it turned out to be that it was Boeing, the official mass media actually started to say the other information that was Boeing and nobody knows who shot it down. But in a few hours later, they started to inform Russians that Boeing was following similar to Putin's course, and probably somebody wanted to shut down Putin's airplane. And of course, who would that be? Those are Ukrainians. And then the fact that on Facebook there was a posting after a few minutes after 4 o'clock, somebody posted that they shut down a plane, and then later on there was another posting there that was an empty Boeing, and that was the conspiracy of the United States with the participation of Europeans. And then later on, in a few days, there was another unbelievable idea that was Ukrainian fighters, that they shot down that plane, and all of those ideas were supported by, for example, Ministry of Defense or other popular people like Mr. Leontiev on Channel 1. And they used even edited picture that Boeing was shot down by Ukrainian fighters. And today, if you talk to Russians, they do not remember what happened at the very first about the very first information or statement that was An-24 airplane. The current Russian society lives by the rules of our what was true yesterday, today is lie, and the other way around. And there is a good anecdote here, or story about it. Have you read the novel 1884? No, I haven't read it. I live in it. The fact is that the An-24 was shut down, and it was shut down by the separatists, was informed by mass media that didn't want to delete their information. You can go even to Itar-Tas right now and look into their archives. This is one of the largest state-owned Russian mass media agency. And on their sites, there is still information that at 4 p.m. An-24 was shut down about the village of Therese by separatists. They still, Life News TV channel had a story, and that story is still in their archives. And this Life News channel is very closely cooperating with separatists, and sometimes their journalists are confused with the separatists because they are dressed in the same uniform. Life News also gave information that there was airplane An-24 shut down right a few minutes after 4 p.m. And that separatists of pro-Russians or Russians, there are several versions there. I will not say who exactly was behind shooting it down, but the fact that separatists have something to do with it, with shooting down the Boeing. There are many evidence about it. In our report, we show major investigations, and they are described in chronological order how it was done with all the investigation of these events, including journalists. There were also local citizens who were questioned. There were also identified the place where Book M system was used for shooting the plane down. And all of the information says that Book M system came from Russia and was made in Russia. And only recently, the official investigative group from the Netherlands, that included representatives from various countries that lost their citizens in this catastrophe, they stated that the most likely version is that the Boeing was shot down by Book M system that came from Russia. But it is important to provide this information to Russia. And they say, well, you got the truth. On July 14th, 2014, July 17th, 2014, you already got that information. Who is responsible for the death of those 298 people on board of Malaysian airline? I believe that it is very important that Boris Nemtsov started this idea. They had this idea, and his associate continued and implemented this idea. Thank you for your attention.